So let me start by saying hello to everyone. I'm Thanos Vostanis. I am a lecturer here at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent. And as you know, many of you know, some of you might not know, we have two ABAI verified courses, postgraduate courses. One is a master's degree in Applied Behaviour Analysis. One is a master's degree in positive behaviour support. And we also have courses in autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, this is our monthly journal club that we do because we are keen to disseminate best practice in behavior analysis. And it's going to be video recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can always revisit it if you want, and you can check it out later on. We also have our TLDR, the Teaser Learning Disability Review, which is our peer-reviewed journal. And I always prompt you guys to submit to us because we're really keen to publish good clinical practice. And it doesn't have to be a huge research project, that's fine. We just want to see some good old practice so that we can disseminate that to other practitioners. Now, some of you are collecting CUs, so the way I'm going to do it is, as always, I'm going to give you 3 keywords throughout the session. Please write them down, and then you just need to email the full name as you want it on the certificate, along with the keywords, and I will prep your certificate for you. I'm going to pop my email in the chat, so don't worry, you're going to have that so you know who to email. We are welcoming Dr. Jackson today, who is a very, very experienced and knowledgeable academic and behavior analyst. She's going to talk to you about something that I find is extremely interesting. I mean, I came across your work, Marianne, and you were one of the first people I noted down to invite to the journal club for this year, because I thought, oh my God, she must be a rocker if she's doing this kind of research. So we definitely need to learn from her. So thank you ever so much for joining us today. Now, I know that you've got a lot of lovely things to talk about, so I'm not going to take much of your time. I'm going to just ask you to take it away, and I'm going to be in the background supporting if there is anything that you guys need. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Jackson. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Thanos, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I realize that for many of you, it's a number of different times of the day and different time zones, but for a lot of you, you've already finished a full work day. So I really appreciate your attention at this late time in the evening. Okay, so the title of my presentation today is going to be ABA, VB, RFT, and LOL. We're going to talk about a behavior analytic approach to humor comprehension. So, okay, that's not going to work. Let's try this. So thank you, first of all, to the Tizard Centre and University of Kent for inviting me to do this. It's one of my favourite research topics to discuss. I also want to do a shout out to my collaborators, who are mostly current and former students, and also some co-authors. You can see all of their names listed there. Wonderful and inspiring young people in our field. I have a few aims for my presentation today. The first is to present really a brief behaviour analytic conceptualisation of humour and what's already been written about that humour, and incorporate into that some of the developmental literature and what that tells us about children's humour. The second is to provide a methodology for teaching humour comprehension based on basic behavioural principles and procedures that might be relevant to a lot of practitioners out there. And then to show you some initial data and some areas of study that we're working on, hopefully in the midst of this to inspire some of you to think about this for clinical application and maybe to inspire others to do some research in this area. Okay. So the first thing I want to start with is a brief introduction of me, of things that are not as boring as the stuff that you've read in my bio. So first of all, I am from a small town in Saltcoats in Ayrshire, which is on the west coast of central Scotland, and I got my undergraduate degree at Strathclyde University in Glasgow, so just in case there's any other Strathclyde Uni people out there. I say this for 2 reasons. One is to explain the accent that you may not have been expecting given my bio that states that I am currently at California State University. And the other is to provide some context for my enthusiasm in this work. I say this because 2 of my biggest reinforcers and things that I really identify with and hold on to very much as a British person, one is my taste in chocolate. No one will ever convince me that there is a better chocolate in the world than dairy milk chocolate. The other is my sense of humor. And so these are just a few of the many people that have influenced my sense of humor over the years. And I do find that I really cling hard to my British sense of humor. So, having said that, this research was also inspired by a clinical case. This is not the actual clinical case. This is my nephew, Logan, when he was around the same age as this kid. But we worked with one little boy with autism. And when he was younger, he was part of our early intervention services. And he would try to tell jokes that didn't quite work as jokes, but he was small and he was cute and everyone found them funny and laughed. And so as he got older, he continued to do this. And people were not quite as forgiving then and would also let him know that they were not quite jokes and not quite funny. So we decided that we would try to teach him a bunch of what are known as dad jokes. My dad is also the king of dad jokes. So all of these sources really convinced me that it was a socially relevant and important subject matter. And so we decided to turn to the behavior analytic literature and see what it came to tell us. So to get started, brief joke. Why did the tomato turn red? Because it saw the salad dressing. Well, I tell you this joke for two reasons. One, if you came to this talk for the jokes, this is as good as they're gonna get. They're jokes that are double meaning jokes that are addressed at young children. I still find them quite funny, but not everyone does. I'm an academic, we're not always known for our great sense of humor. But also that there's a lot of research out there that suggests just by telling you this joke, whether you laughed or not, you already will perceive me as smarter, more confident, and possibly as a more worthy leader. The research also tells us that this is not just beneficial for those who tell jokes. There's a lot of wide and varied benefits of humor, which include establishing and maintaining relationships, reducing your stress and anxiety, improving your problem solving. It can help with pain management, recovery from addiction, recovery from traumatic brain injuries. It can improve your immune system functioning. Apparently there's at least one study that shows it can increase your natural killer cells. So in other words, I wouldn't go as far as to say laughter is the best medicine. Certainly trust in medicine and science, but it's pretty good and it can be pretty important in a number of different ways. When we think of the social benefits, if you pause for a minute and think of any of you that are in the dating world right now, one of the most common things that comes up when people have a profile and think they're looking for is a good sense of humor. If you also take a moment and think about someone in your own life that you laugh a lot with, think about that person for a minute. And even if you're not smiling overtly, you likely are covertly, and it tends to bring this kind of warm and fuzzy feeling along with it. So the research also tells us that it's generally considered beneficial in lots of types of relationships. Specifically for children, there's lots of forms of non-literal language, of which humor is one, that are used in up to about 5% of interactions as early as kindergarten or primary one. And that increases to about 20% by 8th grade or maybe your first year of secondary school. Deficits in humor can result in bullying and impairments in social and emotional development. So it certainly seemed to be an important area in which we could maybe develop a technology for remedying any deficits, especially in special populations that we work with. So when we turned to the literature of what was already known about the development of humor and the skills that went into that kind of repertoire of humor comprehension, one of the main people in this area of research was McGee, and he really laid out some stages of humor that started with little kids about like birth to 6 months and went all the way through the development to what he called stage 5, riddles and joke telling, which really was these double meaning jokes. And this area is going to really be the focus of our study. And he really compared those with a lot of Piaget's cognitive development stages. So what McGee's literature and studies really showed that there was a correlation between cognitive development and humor comprehension and appreciation, which is how funny you find something, that there was a significant relationship between age and humor comprehension, but not necessarily appreciation. And we'll come back to that later. So we thought this was a pretty socially valid target for an intervention within ABA. So when we looked at behavior analytic accounts of humor, there weren't many, but the ones that were there were particularly helpful. So Skinner, first of all, the first thing that Skinner did for us was told us this was something we could objectively measure, that yes, some of the subjective self-report measures that were used in other studies could be helpful because it can be a subjective subject matter, but also we could measure it objectively by measuring things like latency to laugh and smile. Skinner also said that a verbal response could be funny for a number of reasons. that it might be an amusing event or something that was awkward, unexpected, or that it could come from a weak or vague response from the speaker, and that would encourage additional sources of strength for the listener that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. And we'll get into this with some examples as we go. So he suggested that in the face of a vague or weak response from a speaker, the listener might be affected by multiple sources of control and by supplementary stimulation in the form of audience and thematic forms of control. And that weak response from the speaker might arise from a vague keyword, an unlikely figurative relation, or an unlikely interverbal relation. And he also stressed, of course, the importance of the listener's behavior in determining the effect of the joke and whether or not it was funny. So if we take an example, why, again, these are examples that are aimed at our target population in this study, which were young children. Why was 6 afraid of 7? Because 7 ate 9. The answer provides a weak response in that it doesn't quite make sense if you take it literally given the question. 8 or 8, remember these are spoken to the children, they're not written. So 8 versus 8 is a vague keyword. And also it has that double meaning, so it's affected by multiple sources of control and involves an unlikely interverbal relation, that's 7, 8, 9, as well as a thematic relation, a fear of something that might eat you. So following on from that, the wonderful Jack Michael and colleagues in 2011 extended on this rule from Skinner and talked more about the divergent and convergent relations in multiple control. So of course, divergent relations being when you have one stimulus that then affects multiple responses, and convergent being when you have multiple stimuli that come together to contribute to evoking one response. They also talk more about thematic relations and the response of the listener. They described humour responses as involving a critical response, a practical effect, and of course, supplementary sources of control. So they gave the example in their article, I used to have a fear of hurdles, but I got over it. So the phrase got over it is in italics because that is what they would call the critical response, the response that has multiple meanings and multiple sources of control. The humour is also evoked by the practical effect of moving past the fear that's involved in multiple control and the second source of stimulation that you can jump over hurdles, but it's also sort of a competing response tendency that results in humour. So Epstein and Joker also in 2007, Joker is this researcher's real name, it's the best name to have if you're doing this kind of research. They suggested a threshold theory of humour from a behavioural analytic perspective. They suggested that the setup of a joke was a type of motivating operation that would strengthen certain covert verbal or perceptual responses to just below what they called the threshold of awareness. And they then suggested that the punchline would push a particular response to or beyond that threshold, and that would evoke a humour response. They said it relies on only a very brief time below the threshold before the punchline comes, and the timing was really critical for them. So for example, if I told one of the previous jokes and the multiple sources of control were already evoked prior to the punchline for you, you wouldn't find it funny. If it takes too long afterwards and someone has to explain the joke, it also tends not to be so funny. So for example, if we use the joke, what do you call a bear with no teeth? A gummy bear. The setup of the joke there strengthens responses that are related to having no teeth, but they're still below threshold, and the punchline brings the responses related to gums, no teeth and gummy, which bears are made of, to the level of threshold that evokes the humour response. We also had an account in the original relational frame theory book in a chapter by Ian Stewart and colleagues in 2001, where they talked about the setup of a joke providing a complete, coherent and somewhat meaningful network of relations, and that punchline represented an incongruity, and what that did was that it caused that initial network to collapse, and then it would reform almost immediately in unexpected or amusing ways. And again, they really focused a lot also on the shared history of the listener. So for example, why did the tomato turn red? It saw the salad dressing. The initial setup, turns red, relates to a ripe tomato. The punchline introduces that incongruency that is resolved by turn red, also being related to embarrassment caused by a state of undress. I told this joke to my 3.5-year-old daughter. I said, why did the tomato turn red? And she said, well, because Mom, you can't eat green tomatoes. Fair enough. She's clearly not quite at this stage of humour comprehension yet. And there's since been a couple of other interesting studies done by Simon Diamond and colleagues, and also Bever and colleagues, that also came from a very relational frame theory type of perspective. The former of those looking at the transfer of humorous functions and the conditions under which that occurs, and in the latter looking at the role of context in humour and the conditions under which it occurs. But as yet, there's still very limited research in behaviour analysis on humour itself, and especially how to directly strengthen or teach relevant repertoires in young children. So to give you a quick overview of all of that literature and sort of what it was suggesting, I created a little diagram. So green things are speaker behaviour and orange is listener behaviour. So that initially the speaker behaviour in delivering the setup, that the setup can be a contextual cue, it can be a motivating operation, and likely has some discriminative functions. Also, when we add the punchline, that provides us supplementary sources of stimulation in the form of multiple and thematic control. And all of this occurs, of course, with a shared history between speaker and listener and some relevant timing on the part of the speaker. Okay. So when we started to look at the behavioural research on this, we started to look at other forms of non-literal language. And there were a few studies done by colleagues of ours, actually a former student of ours and some of her colleagues, in other areas of non-literal language. For example, they had looked at establishing, Persicki and colleagues looked at establishing metaphorical reasoning for kids with autism, detecting and responding to sarcastic comments, and detecting and responding to deceptive statements. The thing that these all had in common is that they taught each of these skill sets across multiple exemplars with a package of rules that were given initially, and then they utilized specific and leading questions and some visual aids as those were required. The other reason to bring this about is that we used a very similar methodology that I'm going to show to you. So this was the study that Thanos was very kind to mention earlier. It is in Java now. It also is available through open access. We got some funding from the university to pay for it to be open access. The purpose of this study was really to examine the feasibility of teaching humour comprehension of double meaning jokes. We did this with neurotypical children in that early transitional stage of jokes. That was a wonderful suggestion by a very smart colleague of mine and friend of mine, Jonathan Tarbox, who suggested that we try this out first with children that did not have a diagnosis of autism before we then worked on it with some children with autism. And the reason for that was that, you know, the Java reviewers commented on this as well when we submitted it. There's something that seems sort of antithetical to the idea that you can teach humour. And so the concern, of course, is do we take all of the humour out of it by teaching it? And so this study really was to see, can we teach humour comprehension of double meaning jokes to young children using a very behaviour analytic approach? So I'm going to run through a little bit of the study, but mostly I'm going to, of course, show you some data, but I also really want to communicate our methodology in the hopes that it might inspire some people to look at this area with some of their clients. So our participants, we had 4 participants in this study. You can see them all listed here. We had 2 males and 2 females, and they were between 5 and 7 years of age. 2 of our participants had sessions in their home, and the other 2 had some on a preschool that is on campus here at California State University, Fresno. Each also had a peer confederate that we utilized in all of our probe sessions because we wanted to ensure that there's a big difference between what children might find funny from an adult versus what kids would find funny when they're telling jokes to each other. So for the 2 children who got sessions in their home, their confederate was an older sibling, and for the other 2, it was a novel confederate. The confederates were aged 7 to 11, so they were clearly past that transitional stage and understood the jokes that they were telling. So our materials. The first thing we started with were initially 74 joke exemplars. You're going to hear these referred to as exemplars because we also had non-exemplars. 52 of these had corresponding drawings that we utilized for teaching when we implemented the visual prompting level. We also had 76 non-exemplars. The non-exemplars were literal statements, so they had the same format as a joke, but they were just a literal statement. So for example, my daughter's response to why did the tomato turn red because you can't eat them when they're green was a very literal statement. And so the reason we had literal statements in here were to act as a control. We wanted to ensure that the children were learning to discriminate, have a sort of discriminated operant of jokes and why they were funny, and then not laughing at the non-exemplars. We didn't want them to learn to just laugh at anything that we said to them as researchers. We also developed a content knowledge assessment. So for each joke exemplar, we had a question about each of the 2 meanings within the joke. So every question that related to that was asked in a semi-random order so that no two questions from the same joke were asked consecutively. So for example, the joke about the gummy bears, we would maybe ask, what's left in your mouth when you have no teeth? And, you know, what is the little bear treat made of? Something like that. So we would ask questions to ensure that they had enough background knowledge about the two different sources of control that would be involved in the joke. And to be honest, that's the main, because my daughter's 3.5, when we try out any of these jokes on her, most of what we realize that she doesn't have some of the content knowledge for some of the meanings that are in there.
Marianne, sorry to interrupt, just to deliver the first keyword, and it's joke. The first keyword is joke. Thank you very much. You can continue. Oh, we've lost your sound. What happened? Oh, you put your AirPods. Okay. I think.
I'm just going to take those out. I think they might have been causing a problem there. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you just fine, just so you know now. Cool.
Okay. Did you give your, were you giving a code there?
I did.
Okay.
You can continue. Thanks.
Okay, so here is a table that gives us some exemplars and some non-exemplars, and then each of the prompting types that we used. So you can see here the first exemplar that we've already discussed, why was 6 afraid of 7? The answer being because 7, 8, 9. The content questions that we would have asked as part of our assessment here would have been what number comes after 7 and before 9, and what does it mean to say that I ate chips? If the participant did not understand the joke when we delivered it, as part of our intervention, we would ask as a leading question. So the idea of the leading and specific questions were to try to evoke the multiple sources of control involved in the joke. And we were trying to do it with as little prompting as possible. So we would start with this leading question, what are 2 meanings of the word ate? And if they still were not able to respond to that, we would ask a specific question, what number comes after 7 and before 9? What does it mean to say yesterday I ate something? And if they still were not able to respond to that, then we would show them the visual aid. And if they still didn't get after that, we just modeled the correct response and had them repeat it. And so you can see we did the same here, laying out what do you call a bear with no teeth, a gummy bear. These were the content knowledge questions. These are the leading questions, the specific questions, and then there would be this nifty little visual aid drawing. These visual aid drawings are actually done by an undergraduate student of ours, Jamie Perez, who was very talented in that area. They were not done by me or any of my fellow researchers. And then we had, of course, a literal question, which was a non-exemplar. What sound does a dog make? Woof, woof. Okay, so in addition to those, we also used a humour comprehension scale. So after we delivered the joke, we would wait for humour appreciation, and then we would ask them to tell us why it was funny. And so we would scale these in terms of comprehension for exemplars and also comprehension of non-exemplars. So essentially they got a score between 1 and 4. If they did not identify any of the targets of the incoherency or the double meaning, or they just repeated the joke back to us, or they didn't provide a response, they scored 1. And that increased all the way through to if they were able to identify both targets of the incoherency explicitly and explain the relation between them, then they would score 4. And anything in between there got a 2 or a 3. And again, you can look at these within the article. And we also had a Likert type scale of funniness that looked a bit like this. So we would deliver the joke initially, we would ask them to tell us, we would wait 10 seconds, first of all, to see whether or not they smiled or laughed. And then we would ask them to tell us if it was not funny, a little funny, funny, or very funny. And then we would deliver the humour comprehension questions. We also had a box of prizes that reinforced appropriate session behaviour. So this was just for sitting appropriately, answering our questions, complying with instructions. And we ensured that at the end of every session, every participant always took home a little prize. Okay, so this is the order in which things went. First, we did our content knowledge assessment. Then we did baseline sessions with the peer. In the first baseline session, we also did a joke telling probe. So we asked them, we interspersed questions where we asked the participant to tell us a joke they knew, because we wanted to see whether they could do that prior to an intervention. And if that improved at all by the end of the intervention, even though we only targeted humour comprehension and we did not target joke telling. So during the baseline sessions with the peers, there was no reinforcement delivered. We just delivered the joke, we delivered the answer, and then we took all of our dependent measures that I described in terms of our appreciation measures of latency to laugh or smile, their rating of funniness, and then their explanation of why it was funny. They then went into multiple exemplar training. Multiple exemplar training, this was where we used that three-step prompting hierarchy that I showed you, the leading question, the specific question, and the visual aid. And when they met our mastery criteria of multiple exemplar training, we went into post-training probes, which also involved peers. And we again did another joke telling probe throughout the post-training probes to see whether or not their joke telling had improved. I should also point out that in the baseline sessions and the post-training sessions, we used entirely novel jokes. It was only in the multiple exemplar training that at some points we repeated some of the jokes as needed because we ran out of jokes and didn't expect to need quite so many. And then also we did these maintenance probes 2 weeks later for 3 out of 4 participants. We did reuse some jokes in there. All of these sessions were composed of 5 exemplars and 5 non-exemplars that were presented in a random order to the participants. So every session began with this instruction. A joke usually has one word that can mean 2 different things. And when you see that Q in there, that means we ask them a question, like we ask them a question about what is a joke? And they'd say it's a word, when it has a word that can mean 2 different things. And then we said when one word means 2 different things, that makes a joke funny because it doesn't make sense. We later took out this doesn't make sense part because at least one of the kids started to just respond with that part of it. And then we said something is not a joke when what you say only means one thing because that makes sense. And then we'd provide the exemplar. Why do bananas have to put sunscreen on before they go to the beach? Because they peel. And we would provide social praise for any correct responses. And we would go into the correction procedure as needed with the 3-step prompt. The first thing after we delivered the punchline was to wait 10 seconds to measure the latency to smile or laugh, if they did at all. And then we presented that emoticon rating of funniness. And then we asked them to tell us why it was funny. So again, here are some examples of what those vague questions would have been. So for the joke, why do bananas have to put on sunscreen before they go to the beach? Because they peel. The vague questions would be, what are 2 meanings of the word peel? Or what word means 2 different things? The specific questions would be, what happens when you get a sunburn? And what do I mean if I say I peeled a banana? The visual prompt would look something like this, and we'd say, look at the picture and tell me why it might be funny. And if they were still not able to give us the correct response about why it was funny, then we would model the answer. The joke is funny because peel can mean you got a sunburn and it can mean the bananas peel. So here are some data, and I'm going to show you that on a slightly smaller scale, the difficulty of doing presentations on a computer when everyone's home versus in a large conference room is that you don't have the big screen effect to put these kind of graphs up here. So this is we utilized a non-concurrent multiple baseline design across participants. So you can see our 4 participants here. We've staggered the baselines. Where you see this dashed line at 15, 15 was our essentially our mastery criteria. They had to meet 15 a certain number of times. That was the mastery criteria we were looking for. The closed circles are the exemplars. So those are the jokes. Those are the ones we're really concerned with increasing. But we did want to see some differentiation between the exemplars, the closed circles, and the non-exemplars, the open circles. And you can see here that we have our baseline, we have our post-training here after intervention, we have our follow-up data, and for at least 2 of our participants, they actually had a second intervention that occurred for them. There we go. So this is what it looks like close up, and I showed you Gloria's because Gloria's are a little easier to see. So you can see that here the open circles are the literal statements. So Gloria already kind of understood the literal statements. And that these closed circles are the exemplars or the jokes. And you can see that she was on a downward trend and not able to understand all components of why they were funny. After the intervention, that popped right up, and then it continued during our follow-up. So all 4 of our participants here demonstrated humour comprehension with novel exemplars. So keep in mind the baseline and the post-training were all novel jokes that they hadn't heard before. And we did get differentiated responding to exemplars and non-exemplars. So they weren't just learning to laugh at anything that we told them. We had 2 participants that required additional sessions of multiple exemplar training. And one of our participants, Haley, was unavailable for post-training follow-up probes, but we did additional post-training probes, and that was just because Haley's parents were moving out of state. So we also found it really important to take these measures of humour appreciation that I've been talking about. So this latency to smile or laugh, and also how funny they rated it to be. So this latency to smile or laugh kind of relates to what Skinner talked about with an objective measure of humour. So what you can see here, this is Phil's graph for latency to smile or laugh. So you can see here on the vertical axis, we're looking at seconds. So it goes 0 to 10 seconds. We timed it out after 10 seconds. If it took them longer than 10 seconds to smile or laugh, we didn't really consider that to be smiling or laughing at the joke. So you can see during baseline, Phil is smiling or laughing initially relatively quickly at exemplars and non-exemplars. So we would give him a very simple literal statement and he would laugh as much at that as he did at the jokes. And then the latency started to increase, so he stopped laughing quite so much at anything we said. Post-training, you can see here, what we're looking for here is the shorter latency to laugh, right? So these closed circles down the bottom here are shorter latencies to laugh, which means that he laughed much more quickly to our jokes than to our literal statements here, which is what we wanted to see. And then we saw something a little similar in follow-up. Phil was interesting in that Phil, kids will do these things when you do studies with them. They will just tell you what time it is. During follow-up, we repeated the use of some jokes that we'd used previously because it was baseline and post-training that were novel jokes. And Phil did laugh, but he also, in these ratings here, reported them as less funny because he would tell us that he had already heard that joke. So you can see in this other graph that's on the bottom right here, we're looking at the rating of funniness, and it goes from 0 to 3. Those are those little emoticon faces that I showed you. During baseline, Phil rated pretty much nothing as funny. During post-training, the closed circles, again, he started to rate as a little funny and funny. And then again, follow-up, he rated them as a little funny and told us that he had already heard those jokes. But again, he continued to rate, during follow-up at least, he rated the non-exemplars as not funny. So those were the appreciation measures. So you can see here for all participants, these are the measures of latency to smile or laugh that showed a very similar practice here. You can see Gloria, again, Gloria was really a little superstar. Her data were beautiful. So for the exemplars in the closed circles, you can see that the latency was going up. But after the intervention, she laughed pretty rapidly at all of our exemplars, but not at our non-exemplars, and did the same in follow-up. And you can see that that occurred across all participants. And this on the right here, you are looking at their rating of funniness. And so you can see here that they did the same thing. Initially rated them as Gloria initially rated them as a bit, the jokes as a bit funnier, but then of course the data paths crossed. But after the intervention, she rated our jokes and exemplars as much funnier than the literal non-exemplars, and the same with follow-up there. In terms of the joke telling probes, if you recall, I said that in baseline and also in post-training, we interspersed some joke telling probes where we asked them to tell us a joke. So we didn't directly teach joke telling in any parts of the study, but we did intersperse them. We conducted them with a peer, and the ratings of funniness were determined by the peer. Because again, what a peer of their age might find funny is different than what we might find funny. But we did rate them for the content of the joke and whether it met the requirements of a double meaning joke. And what we found was 2 participants improved, 1 got worse, and 1 didn't respond at all. Of the 2 participants that improved, Gloria went from being able to tell us 1 joke in the beginning to telling us 3 pretty good jokes by the end. Haley went from 0 to 1, but Dad did later tell us that he had taught her that joke. Phil appeared to get worse, but actually the initial 3 jokes that Phil had told us, he had there were indications he had memorized them, because at one point he got it wrong and then went back and had to think about it and got it right. And then Dad later told us he had taught him some of those jokes prior to the study. And then he tried to tell one at the end that had a similar format to why is 6 afraid of 7, that joke. And he said, why was 5 afraid of 10? Because 5 plus 5 is 10. So clearly that didn't meet criteria as being a joke, but he had a good go at it. And Mitch did not make any attempt to tell a joke on either the baseline or the post-training probes. We did get some generalization reported by parents. So for example, Gloria's mom sent us a video after the study of her out at sushi with her siblings, and she had drawn some of the emoticon faces on a napkin and was holding the chopstick and telling a joke and asking her siblings to rate them as not funny, a little funny, funny, or very funny, which we thought at least was a good social validity measure in addition to our actual social validity measures, to suggest that she found the study enjoyable. And Phil's parents actually had a wedding celebration not long after the study ended, and said that he was just having a lovely time going around telling jokes to many of the wedding guests. So some indications that they did enjoy the study. So some limitations in further research. So we need more investigation of the prerequisite skills, and you'll see that when I show you some additional sort of pilot data we have. And potentially we need this for all levels of humour development. We've also discussed the relevance of getting some normative sampling. So when we start to teach this to kids, especially any special populations, so to maybe some of the kids with autism that we work with, it would be really helpful to know the extent to which other kids of a similar age are using these types of jokes in their day-to-day life. I mean, we do have some data that suggests that, you know, little kids, for example, around the age of 5, laugh hundreds of times a day, and by the time we get to our 20s and 30s, that has dropped dramatically. But it would be useful to have some normative sampling of this type of human in that age group. And it seems like both of these things will be necessary to remedy any deficits in our clinically relevant populations. It also seems like appreciation is a more complex phenomenon. We had a very contrived situation, even for the participants in their own homes and those in the preschool. It was a novel peer for those in the preschool. But, you know, having an experimenter sit and watch and kind of rate things when you are telling jokes with your friends is not the same as a naturally occurring situation where kids are telling each other jokes. So we do think that we'll have to look into the importance of that, as well as some other prerequisite skills that are probably a lot of verbal skills, some areas of multiple control, and some areas of intraverbal control. It's also unclear so far if humour comprehension will lead to effective joke telling or vice versa. There is a portion of the PEAK curriculum by Dixon and colleagues where they actually have a programme for teaching joke telling, but it's unclear whether or not children can comprehend why the joke's funny, or they're simply learning the jokes, and would they be able to come up with their own. Peters and colleagues in 2019 used this area of the PEAK curriculum to evaluate social engagement for 2 children with autism. And they did find they could teach them to tell the jokes, but had no measures of comprehension. But they didn't see consistent differences in social engagement. They found small increases for one child and no differences for the other. So those things, it seems, would be important to look at that. We do have a current study actually looking at the interaction between humour comprehension and joke telling that we can talk about a little later. So it also was part of our reason for doing this study was that it might be beneficial for relevant populations within applied behaviour analysis. So non-literal language is a common area of difficulty for some individuals with autism spectrum disorder. I want to be clear that not all individuals with autism spectrum disorder will necessarily have this difficulty, and many members of the ASD community are incredibly funny. But when this is an area of difficulty, it can really present some social barriers. These difficulties can contribute to other areas of social difficulty like negative aspects of bullying, and limit many of the other benefits that have been shown to come from humour. So we did a study, well, almost 2 years ago now. We titled it An Examination of Telehealth Interventions to Teach Humour Comprehension to Individuals with ASD. Like many academics, this was never intended to be a telehealth study. It was approved by our Institutional Review Board in December of 2019. And actually January of 2020 maybe, for ethical review, and then the pandemic hit and we pivoted quickly to making it a telehealth intervention because many of our ABA services also went to the telehealth model of care. So we figured we could use this telehealth intervention. So now it was sort of doing two things. It was looking at the effectiveness of telehealth to directly teach skills to individuals with ASD and also to teach humour comprehension. So this was the master's thesis of a student of mine, Matisse Lovett, and also her colleague Shaylee Eid, who helped out a great deal. We had 3 participants, Aubrey, Bo, and...
Sorry to interrupt. Just to give the second keyword, let's go with pandemic. The second keyword is pandemic. Now, Marianne, I've got a question that might be relevant to what we just talked about in your previous slide. So should I keep it for the end, or would you like me? I don't want to break your flow. Should I go for it now?
Yeah.
So it's about the possibility of harm when it comes to reinforcing the idea that autistic individuals might lack a sense of humor and trying to condition it to resemble more neurotypical social behaviors instead of allowing them to express themselves a bit more authentically in a way that's more intrinsic to them. So how can we guard against that, just to make sure that as a field we appreciate, you know, the fact that people can be neurodiverse and have a different way of, you know, exhibiting their sense of humor? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, that's a great question, and we did want to make the point that many members of the autistic community are incredibly funny, and we only really, when we looked at this with kids with autism, in the study that I'm going to discuss here, we really only recruited from participants where parents reported that it already presented some social difficulties for individuals with autism. One other area that one of our students is particularly interested in is looking at how we incorporate preferences for stimuli into the kind of humour interventions that we implement, so that we're not necessarily just assessing for content knowledge related to jokes that we bring to the table, but that we ask about preferences and interests so that we can incorporate as many of the individual's interests into the sort of humour that we're looking at. But of course, these are areas that we also have to be incredibly sensitive around. And so with this particular study, we really only recruited participants where there was already a reported deficit. We have a social skills group that runs on campus, and it really came from either individuals or with this particular study, parents who reported that it already presented some social difficulties for their children. And we had very clear criteria there that if the kids at any point were not having a good time and enjoying the intervention, that it stopped immediately. Okay, so here we go. So for these participants here, you'll see that there's a diverse age range here. We were not able to include peer confederates the same way because again, it was a pandemic and we were doing this via telehealth. So we had one peer confederate on video who delivered jokes for some of these probes. All of our participants were highly verbal kids. They understood spoken sentences of 5 words or more and could also follow multi-step instructions. We also did a quick attending test for telehealth, so they could attend to what we were doing. So these were the initial results that we got here for humour comprehension measures. So you can see that for Bo here, Bo just needed experience with the format really that we were using and demonstrated already pretty nice levels of mastery within that baseline. So that was Bo was all done with the study at that point. You can see here with Aubrey and also with Amy that we saw fairly similar patterns of acquisition. You can actually see the intervention data in these graphs that were omitted from the JABA publication. We only showed the probes and the post-probes in the JABA publication. These participants, Aubrey and Amy, did require a few more sessions of intervention than in our last study. And also it would be really important again to find out what kind of prerequisite skills were in Bo's repertoire that allowed such rapid acquisition. The one thing that we saw here for Aubrey is that Aubrey essentially would be able to report that they were funny and really enjoyed her sessions with all of our team, and Dad said really looked forward to them, but never laughed at them. And so again, there are really no consequences for these appreciation measures. They're just kind of happening as they go. The only social praise or correction was provided was for the comprehension measure. So she didn't find them funny enough to laugh. She didn't find them funny enough to laugh. We did later find that when Dad laughed, she started to laugh, which again sort of indicates the importance of that social context that might be very relevant to human appreciation. There's a lot of data out there, of course, that show that people tend to laugh harder at humorous material when they are surrounded by other people who are also there to laugh at humorous material. But you can see here, of course, that for Aubrey acquired not only the humour comprehension, but was able to differentiate between the exemplars and non-exemplars in terms of what was funny or not funny in a self-report, and that Amy showed very similar patterns of slightly lower latencies to laugh, especially in the follow-up for Amy. And also similarly able to report what was funny, not funny. But again, Amy really kind of jumped up in our final follow-up phases there. So the intervention here was somewhat successfully teaching comprehension for 2 of our 3 participants, and the other participant required it without any intervention, which leads us to think about further investigation of appreciation and what are the variables that go into that, and how does that lend itself to individual preferences, the influence of others laughing, some visualization strategies and drawings. There's some interesting research out there by Judah Axe and some other colleagues looking at visualization strategies for things like problem solving. So could we fade our visual prompts to sort of visualization strategies for kids that we work with? And also looking at more relevant subject matter and the inclusion of those as preferred stimuli in our teaching. We looked at how these could really be used to directly target the benefits of humour and laughter. So really just strengthening repertoires in kids and increasing the fluency of finding humour in everyday situations where it's appropriate and relevant. There are some suggestions also, some of the work that we've been doing in the area of ACT right now, acceptance and commitment training within behaviour analysis, that it might be useful in diffusion components of that kind of work, that a lot of diffusion exercises tend to involve a core component of humour. That there might be possible benefits for older adult populations with neurodegenerative disorders. And here are some of the studies that we actually have in the works right now. We are looking at joke telling versus humour comprehension. And so that study, Tabitha Garcia, one of my wonderful honour students, she's an undergraduate, very inspiring, very smart young woman, is doing this study with neurotypical children without a diagnosis of any sort of language delay. And we're looking at if we teach humour comprehension and probe joke telling, how much joke telling do we get from teaching humour comprehension? If we teach joke telling and probe humour comprehension, do we get the comprehension from the joke telling? And then also a third group where we might look at doing some multiple exemplar instruction when we teach the joke telling and humour comprehension in an alternating fashion within the same sessions. We're also looking to get more data on the confirmation on the developmental stages of humour, and of course the relevant repertoires. It seems like a lot of those repertoires are very amenable to behaviour analytic accounts, and would involve a number of the targets that are laid out in a variety of kind of language-based curricula that are implemented already. And of course, as I mentioned already, the use of some visualization strategies we feel like could be incredibly helpful, especially as if you think about the jokes that we told there, even though they're meant for young children, when you appreciate those kind of jokes, you sort of have those perceptual functions of seeing the humorous component in it. So we thought there for a little bit about how we might include those kind of visualization strategies in some of our work with children. And one last joke for you here. What do you call an alligator in a vest? An investigator. And on that note, thank you for your attention. We have some time here for questions. And this is my email here. I'd be more than happy to respond to any emails people wanted to send me, or anyone who's interested in doing any of this similar kind of work, or is looking for materials, etc. Or if for some reason you are looking for the Java article and can't get your hands on it, please feel free to email me. Thank you for your time. I'm open to questions if you have any.
Thank you, Marianne. That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. That was definitely really, really interesting, at least for me. especially how you engage in concept formation for developing the skill, the ability to appreciate jokes and so on. The use of examples and non-examples, and the use of novel exemplars to probe for generalization and so on. It's a very beautiful instructional design there, and a lot of generative work clearly happening, which is really interesting for me at least. Our last keyword, just so you guys know, is investigator. Our last keyword is investigator. Now, guys, pop your questions in the chat. I've got another, it's more of a comment as a follow-up comment to the previous question, that why not focus on developing interventions for those who bully instead of trying to protect autistic kiddos through this type of interventions. And the person is worrying that forcing compliance with neurotypical social conventions can lead to harm, which I think is it's a valid point.
Yes.
Marianne, I'm assuming like you would. What
Yes,
are your thoughts on this?
I want to be really clear, there was no forced compliance with any of this. So the only thing we were teaching was really a comprehension of the two components in the joke, the comprehension of the multiple control of the joke. There were never any differential consequences delivered for any of the appreciation measures. So whether the person laughed or not, there were no differential consequences for that either way, and there were no differential consequences for their ratings of funniness. The only thing we were really teaching was the comprehension part of it. In terms of the bullying, I couldn't agree more, and in fact, it's kind of interesting to see more of that work. So our aim with this is not to address the fact that kids with autism might get bullied. Our aim with this is really to provide, humor is such a rich, everyday part of most people's lives, and so the aim really is just to kind of open that door and then to sort of follow those preferences with it. The bullying component that's in there is just one aspect of what the literature in humor has already shown is something that can make social interactions a little bit more difficult for children in general. Actually, it's not, that literature is not specific to individuals with autism at all. So I'd absolutely agree with the point that's being made, but that wasn't the direction of the study. The direction of the study was really just to open up the world of humor comprehension and not to provide any consequences for that comprehension, for that appreciation, but really just to teach the comprehension component of it.
Thank you for that. I think it's as you say, we need to always take these things into account. We need to be very careful and take all this feedback in so we can improve our work. Lois says, so interesting. I was wondering when the little girl didn't laugh, but did when dad laughed. Would this be a route of social masking?
Potentially, and actually that occurred outside of sessions because dad was not, she had other siblings, so dad was not sitting right next to her. So it absolutely could be, yes. And I think that's something that would need a lot more investigation, because again, that wasn't, we wanted to be really clear that we weren't interested in kids just laughing for the sake of laughing, which was why we never differentially consequated the laughter responses. We didn't want to teach them they had to laugh at something that wasn't funny to them. And so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon to tread that thin line between, most of us, if we go to see a comedy show or we sit in, there are very few, I have a very deep love for a lot of stand-up comedians, especially British stand-up comedians. And there's very few who can make me laugh really hard if I'm on my own. But if I'm watching them with other people, there's a lot of data about that tendency to laugh when you're surrounded by other people who are also laughing. But I think there's a very fine line to tread between those kind of data, and we don't want people to just be laughing because other people are laughing if they either don't understand the joke or just don't find the joke funny. But I also think, like what we tend to often do is have or watch those kind of comedians with people with whom we share that kind of sense of humor.
Well, I have to say that I did spot Ricky Gervais among the crowd there when you started. And I thought, if she likes Ricky, she's got a great sense of humor. Although he doesn't always pull his punches, truth is. But yes. Any other questions, guys? And I'm getting some private messages here saying thank you very much. That's okay. It's a pleasure. I know you guys enjoyed it. Okay, it seems that I don't have any additional questions. So, Marianne, thank you ever so much for this beautiful presentation. We would definitely love to have you again so you can talk to us about some of the work that is ongoing because it looks like there's a lot of room for us here to delve a bit more. Can I ask a question actually? Because I do appreciate some of the points made by the people attending. You're gonna get the PowerPoints, don't worry, she's been brilliant, she's already sent it to me. What about co-production? Have you thought about this? Because this type of work, I think it would be really interesting to try something along the lines of co-production. Have you guys considered that at all in your research group?
No, tell me more about what you're thinking with that.
Well, in the sense of, I suppose because it's such a tricky area when you have people who are diverse and they might find completely different things than the neurotypical individual funny. If you in a way try to set it up so that they guide the process, they guide the research questions, because I can see that there is an increasing focus on co-production in research recently, especially for people who have diagnosis. So do you think there is room for something like that within your work?
Actually, there's two areas in which I think that becomes relevant. One is, I don't want to say specifically, but one of my collaborators in this area is actually an autistic adult and had some of those questions come up and sort of guided some of the focus on how do we get into the joke telling portion of it. And so it seems like when we get into the studies where we're looking at both joke telling and humour comprehension coming together, that our kids would be coming up with those jokes, which actually when we sat down to think about it and to come up with novel, it's really hard to come up with double meaning jokes on your own. They're not easy to come up with. And so I think that part of that and part of what that student brought to that discussion was this idea that if our kids are coming up with the jokes, we can follow their interests, their preferences, and their sense of humour a little bit more, bringing those together. And then the jokes that some kids come up with, we can then use in the humour comprehension potentially for other participants, and that we could kind of go back and forth that way, because what I, as a 43-year-old woman, think is a funny joke that I came up with may not be funny at all to any kids. And so we definitely thought about that, yes.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so thank you very much. Someone says that they love the jokes as well, and I have to admit that I did crack up with some of them. I have to admit this one is my favorite one, the alligator, and that's why I gave the keyword for the investigator. But anyway, okay, Dr. Jackson, thank you again. Guys, please email me your 3 keywords at the email that I'm gonna type again in the chat if you haven't got it already. And please put your full name as you want it on the certificate. Also note that it takes about, we have about 40 to 45 days to issue the CEU. So if you don't hear back from me straight away, do not worry. I have gotten your email and I'm gonna prep it for you. And I'm gonna include the PowerPoint slides from Dr. Jackson as you guys requested. She has, as I said, she's been brilliant and she's already sent them to me. All right, thank you ever so much. And hopefully we will host you again in another journal club. Thank you, Marianne.